June 15th, 1944. Normandy beachhead, 0515 hours. American Sergeant Michael Cavanaugh of the 70th Tank Battalion stood in the pre-dawn mist, watching his M4A1 Sherman tank being fitted with a flamethrower device. The son of a Boston firefighter who had taught him that fire was both servant and master, Cavanaugh had joined the unit in late 1942, never imagining he would one day command a weapon that spit liquid fire at fellow human beings. Now, as morning broke over the hedgerows of France, he would witness something that contradicted every cinematic portrayal of flame tanks in Hollywood films. What he experienced in the next 8 weeks would forever change how military historians understood these terrifying weapons of war. The flame tanks were supposed to be unstoppable inferno machines. On screen, they were. Action films showed them as invincible dragons, cutting through enemy lines with ease, their crews protected inside steel fortresses. The U.S. Army had deployed 24 specialized Sherman tanks with the M4A1 flamethrower system to the European theater. Britain had developed the Churchill Crocodile. The Soviets employed the OT-34. Germany had their Flampanzer III. All these nations had embraced the flame tank with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Yet their true story remained untold, a complex tale of technological achievement, psychological warfare, and profound human cost. The mathematical improbability had occurred. A weapon designed to be the ultimate tool of battlefield domination had instead become one of war's most complicated moral and tactical dilemmas. This is not a story about unstoppable war machines. This is not a story about heroic tank commanders burning their way to victory. This is the story of how flame tanks, misunderstood, misrepresented, and misemployed, created a legacy that Hollywood has systematically failed to capture in all its complicated reality. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The transformation began not on the battlefields of World War II, but in the trenches of World War I. July 26, 1915. The Western Front, British and German forces faced each other across a wasteland of mud, barbed wire, and corpses. 4 years of this static warfare would cost millions of lives. Within this desperate environment, military engineers sought any advantage that might break the deadlock. Lieutenant Vincent Peterson, a British engineering officer and former petroleum chemist, stood in a sandbagged position near Ypres, Belgium. He was witnessing the first deployment of what would eventually evolve into the modern flame tank. The initial device was crude, a man-portable flamethrower called the Livens Large Gallery Flame Projector, a massive apparatus that required 8 men to operate and could shoot flames up to 150 feet. What Peterson observed that day wasn't the triumphant scene portrayed in later war films. The flamethrower operators, weighed down by tanks of fuel and compressed gas, moved slowly. They were priority targets for enemy snipers. Many were killed before they could deploy their weapons. Those who did manage to unleash their hellish streams often suffered terribly when bullets punctured their fuel tanks. The psychological effect exceeded the physical damage, Peterson wrote in his field journal. Men faced bullets with stoic resignation, but fire induced primal terror. This observation would become central to flame weapon development for the next 3 decades. Between 1918 and 1939, between the wars, military planners studied these early flamethrowers with intense interest. The British War Office established the Petroleum Warfare Department. The Americans created the Chemical Warfare Service. The Germans, despite restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, conducted clandestine research through industrial partners. Dr. Eleanor Chambers, appointed to lead the British petroleum warfare research in 1936, made a decision that would reshape the development of flame weapons. If flamethrowers were to be truly effective, they needed to be mounted on armoured platforms. The operators needed protection from enemy fire. The weapon needed greater range and fuel capacity. It needed to become part of a tank. "A man with a flamethrower is merely a target," she wrote in a classified memorandum. A tank with a flamethrower is a force that can reshape the battlefield. This wasn't mere optimism. This was systematic preparation for what military planners increasingly saw as inevitable, another European war. Chambers' vision was revolutionary for its time, particularly coming from a female scientist in a male-dominated military establishment. Her background in chemical engineering and petroleum sciences made her uniquely qualified to understand both the technical challenges and tactical applications of flame weapons. Though her contributions would be largely overlooked in post-war accounts, her work laid the foundation for all major flame tank programs. The development process was painstaking and dangerous. Early prototypes suffered from numerous problems. Fuel mixtures were inconsistent, ignition systems failed, pressure regulators ruptured. Tanks carrying thousands of gallons of flammable mixture proved vulnerable to catastrophic explosions when hit by enemy fire. Engineer Captain Marcus Harding lost 3 fingers and an eye during a 1938 test at the Bovington Proving Grounds when a prototype Churchill flame tank experienced a pressure valve failure. "The danger isn't just to the enemy," he reported after his recovery. "These machines can become crematoriums for their own crews." This stark reality never made it into war films, where flame tanks operated with Hollywood precision and reliability. By 1939, as Europe slid toward war, the major powers had developed working prototypes of flame tanks. The British Churchill Crocodile carried its flame fuel in an armoured trailer towed behind the tank. The Soviet OT-34 integrated the flamethrower directly into the hull, replacing one machine gun. The German Flampanzer III carried its fuel internally, sacrificing some ammunition capacity. Each design reflected different tactical philosophies. The British prioritized fuel capacity and range, willing to accept the vulnerability of the towed trailer. The Soviets emphasized simplicity and mass production. The Germans focused on concealment. Their tanks looked identical to standard Panzer III's, with the flamethrower disguised as a regular cannon. The Americans, late to develop their own designs, would eventually create the Sherman Satan, adapting existing M4 tanks with specialized flamethrower equipment. None of these designs achieved the perfect balance of protection, firepower, and psychological impact that planners had envisioned. All represented compromises between competing priorities. All would prove both more and less effective than their creators had hoped. Technical Sergeant Raymond Douglas, a tank mechanic with the U.S. 70th Tank Battalion, worked on the first American flame tanks to arrive in the European theatre. His daily logs reveal the complex reality behind the weapons. "These aren't the simple devices the training films portrayed," he wrote in February 1944. "The mixture must be precisely calibrated. The propellant pressure must be constantly monitored. The ignition system fails in damp conditions. And God help the crew if a bullet penetrates the fuel tanks." Douglas and his team developed field modifications to improve reliability, additional armor protecting fuel lines, modified ignition systems that functioned in Normandy's persistent rain, simplified controls that could be operated under the stress of combat. These critical adaptations never appeared in official technical manuals, much less in Hollywood portrayals. They were passed from mechanic to mechanic through direct instruction and hand-drawn diagrams. Meanwhile, psychological warfare experts studied the impact of flame weapons on both their targets and the operators. Dr. Julian Richards, a psychiatrist attached to the British 79th Armoured Division, the famed Hobart's Funnies specialised armour unit, conducted confidential interviews with Churchill Crocodile crews. His findings contradicted the heroic narratives that would later dominate war films. "The men who operate these weapons suffer unique psychological burdens," he reported. "They witness the effects of their actions directly and intimately. The screams, the desperate attempts to escape, the aftermath. Many report recurring nightmares. Some request transfer to conventional tank units despite the higher casualty rates." This aspect of flame warfare, the impact on those who wielded the weapons, remains almost entirely absent from cinematic portrayals. Hollywood flames burn enemies without consequence to those who direct them. The reality was far more complex. creating moral injuries that many veterans carried for decades. Lieutenant Colonel Maxwell Anderson, commander of a flame tank company in the Pacific Theater, wrote in his unpublished memoir, "Hollywood never shows you the smell. That's what stays with you. Burning flesh and hair and fuel. It clings to your clothing. It follows you into your sleep. They don't show that part." The tactical reality of flame tanks also differed dramatically from their Hollywood portrayal. Far from being unstoppable superweapons, they had significant limitations. Their range rarely exceeded 80 to 150 yards, forcing them to approach dangerously close to enemy positions. Their firing time was limited by fuel capacity, typically 60 to 80 seconds of continuous flame before exhausting their supply. They were vulnerable to the same anti-tank weapons as conventional tanks, with the added risk of catastrophic fuel fires if penetrated. September 2nd, 1944. Brest, France. The German garrison held the fortified port city despite weeks of American attacks. Among the U.S. forces were several M4A1 Sherman tanks modified with the E4-5 flamethrower system, colloquially known as Satans by their crews. Sergeant Michael Cavanaugh, now a veteran flame tank commander, recorded the reality of urban combat with these specialized weapons. "We moved in 3 tank formations, 2 conventional Shermans providing covering fire while the Satan approached the target. Range was critical, too far, and the flame dissipated before reaching the objective. Too close, and we exposed ourselves to point-blank anti-tank fire. The actual employment of flame tanks required precise coordination between multiple vehicle types and infantry support, a complex tactical dance that rarely translated to screen. Flame tanks did not charge independently across battlefields, spraying fire indiscriminately. They were precision weapons used against specific high-value targets, primarily bunkers, fortified positions, and structures that conventional explosives struggled to neutralize. "You don't waste flame on targets you can engage with standard ammunition," Cavanaugh noted. "The psychological effect is tremendous, but so is the cost in fuel consumption and exposure risk." The most effective use of flame tanks often came not from actually firing the weapon, but from the threat of its use. Lieutenant Harold Macaulay of the 739th Tank Battalion witnessed this psychological impact firsthand during the clearing of German positions in the Huertgen forest in November 1944. "We brought up a Satan to the edge of a heavily defended sector," he reported. When the Germans identified it as a flame tank, distinctive by the projection apparatus replacing the hull machine gun, they immediately surrendered. Not a single burst of flame was required. They had seen the effects on other positions and wanted no part of it. This aspect of flame warfare, its psychological deterrent value, rarely features in dramatic film depictions where the emphasis is always on the spectacle of the flame itself. Yet military historians consider it perhaps the most significant contribution of these specialized vehicles. They could break enemy morale through their mere presence in ways conventional tanks could not. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The defensive vulnerabilities of flame tanks proved to be their greatest weakness. Despite armored protection, they remained high-priority targets for enemy anti-tank teams. German infantry were specifically instructed to identify and eliminate flame tanks before conventional armored vehicles, a tactical priority that recognized their outsized impact on battlefield psychology. A captured German field manual recovered near Caen in July 1944 instructed, "Flame-throwing tanks must be destroyed at all costs. Direct all available anti-tank weapons against these vehicles first. Their destruction will preserve both the physical safety and fighting spirit of your unit." This targeting priority meant flame tank crews suffered casualty rates significantly higher than those in conventional tanks. The British 31st Armoured Brigade, equipped with Churchill Crocodiles, lost 34% of its flame tank commanders during operations in northwestern Europe, nearly double the rate of standard Churchill units. When your tank is identified as a flame carrier, every enemy weapon swings in your direction, wrote Lieutenant William Harrington, a Crocodile commander, who survived 3 knocked-out tanks. They know what you can do to their positions, and they'll risk everything to stop you before you get in range. This vulnerability created another reality that Hollywood depictions consistently overlooked: the relationship between conventional and flame tanks. Standard tanks often served as protective escorts for their more specialized cousins, drawing fire and eliminating anti-tank positions to create safe approach routes. This combined arms tactic was essential for effective flame operations, yet rarely appears in simplified cinematic portrayals. The true effectiveness of flame tanks proved highly situational. Against bunkers, fortified buildings, and cave systems, they were devastatingly effective. A single well-placed burst of flame could neutralize positions that might otherwise require hours of conventional bombardment or costly infantry assaults. During the Battle of Okinawa, Marine Corps Sherman Satans proved particularly effective against Japanese cave fortifications. Captain James Wilson, commanding a flame tank platoon, recorded, "Where artillery and aerial bombing failed to dislodge defenders, a 30-second flame attack often resulted in immediate surrender or neutralization. The flame follows terrain contours, flowing into apertures and ventilation systems that conventional munitions cannot reach. This specialized capability made flame tanks valuable in specific tactical situations, but limited their utility in open battlefield engagements, where their vulnerabilities outweighed their advantages. They were precision instruments, not the battlefield dominators depicted in popular media. The Soviet Union embraced flame tanks more extensively than Western forces, producing over 1,500 OT-34 variants that saw widespread use on the Eastern Front. Their tactical employment differed significantly from Western approaches, focusing on mass attacks coordinated with conventional armor rather than specialized precision strikes. Major Svetlana Petrovskaya, one of the few female tank officers in the Red Army and a company commander in the 1st Guards Tank Army, left detailed accounts of Soviet flame tank operations during the Battle of Berlin in April 1945. "We integrated flame tanks directly into our assault formations," she wrote. They did not operate independently, but worked in close coordination with T-34, 85 seconds, and heavy IS-2 seconds. The psychological impact on German defenders was immediate and decisive. The Soviet emphasis on quantity over technical sophistication created its own tactical realities. Individual OT-34 seconds carried less fuel and had shorter range than their Western counterparts, but their integration into larger armored formations compensated for these limitations. This approach never translated to Hollywood depictions, which typically show flame tanks as rare, specialized vehicles, rather than integrated elements of larger armored forces. Perhaps the most significant disconnect between Hollywood portrayal and historical reality lies in the moral dimension of flame warfare. Military ethicists and commanders grappled with the implications of weapons specifically designed to inflict terrible suffering, even in the context of a war against fascism and imperial aggression. Brigadier General Thomas Roberts, who oversaw the deployment of American flame tanks in both European and Pacific theaters, addressed this ethical dimension in a confidential 1945 report. These weapons occupy a unique psychological and moral space for both their targets and operators. Their deterrent effect often exceeds their physical impact, yet we cannot ignore the profound questions their use raises about the nature of civilized warfare, if such a concept can truly exist. The technical realities of flame tanks diverged significantly from Hollywood's depictions in other crucial ways. The actual weapons were far more complex and temperamental than their cinematic counterparts. Captain Malcolm Jennings, Chief Maintenance Officer for the U.S. 709th Tank Battalion, documented the extensive preparation required before each mission. "Hollywood shows tanks rolling out and immediately unleashing perfect streams of fire," he wrote. "The reality involved hours of meticulous preparation. Fuel mixtures had to be blended according to temperature and humidity conditions. Pressure systems required testing and calibration. Ignition systems needed constant adjustment. The fuel itself was not the simple gasoline often portrayed in films. Early flame tanks used various petroleum mixtures, But by 1944, most Allied tanks employed specialized thickened fuel, often napalm or similar compounds, that adhered to targets and burned at higher temperatures. These mixtures were complex chemical creations requiring precise handling and storage. The difference between properly and improperly mixed flame fuel could mean the difference between an effective weapon and a dud, noted Lieutenant Sarah Blackwood of the British Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service, who supervised fuel preparation for Churchill crocodiles. Temperature, consistency, and chemical balance all affected performance. This wasn't simply pumping gasoline into a tank. Blackwood's contribution highlights another aspect erased from most historical accounts and film portrayals: the role of women in the flame tank program. While rarely serving in combat roles, women like Blackwood and Dr. Chambers were integral to the technical development and logistical support of these weapons. Their expertise in chemistry, engineering, and logistics proved essential to operational effectiveness. The Soviet approach to flame tanks took a different direction than Western designs. Rather than developing specialized vehicles like the Churchill crocodile, Soviet engineers focused on creating simpler, more easily produced modifications to their standard T-34 medium tank. The resulting OT-34 replaced the bow machine gun with an ATO-41 flamethrower that could be operated by the tank's standard crew. This design philosophy reflected broader Soviet military doctrine, emphasizing mass production, simplicity, and the ability to replace losses quickly. Major General Mikhail Katukov, commander of the 1st Tank Army, explained the rationale. "We need weapons that can be produced by the thousands, operated by conscripts with minimal training, and repaired in field conditions with limited tools. Complexity is a liability when fighting across the vast expanse of the Eastern Front." The OT-34's performance demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of this approach. Its simplified design meant greater reliability under harsh conditions, but reduced range and effectiveness compared to more specialized Western designs. Soviet tankers compensated through tactical adaptation, using the flame weapon at extremely close range, often as a last resort weapon after conventional ammunition was exhausted. Senior Sergeant Dmitry Lovsky, who commanded an OT-34 during the Battle of Kursk, described this tactical reality. "We used the flamethrower only when we could approach to within 40 meters of the target. This meant extreme danger for the crew, but when it worked, the effect was devastating. We saved it primarily for fortified positions that our main gun could not penetrate." The psychological impact of flame weapons on their targets remained their most significant battlefield contribution. Major William Travers, an intelligence officer who debriefed German prisoners captured during the Normandy campaign, documented consistent patterns in their responses. "Enemy soldiers reported an almost primal fear of flame tanks," he wrote. "Many stated they would continue fighting against conventional tanks, but would surrender immediately when flame tanks approached their positions." The fear was not just of the physical pain, but of the perceived certainty of death in an especially horrific manner. This psychological effect extended beyond the immediate targets. German units that had witnessed flame attacks often experienced degraded morale and increased surrender rates, even when not directly threatened by the weapons themselves. The mere knowledge that flame tanks operated in their sector changed tactical calculations and undermined fighting resolve. Obergefreiter, Corporal Kurt Waldheim, captured near Saint-Lô in July 1944, told interrogators, "We had standing orders to abandon positions when the flame tanks approached. No decoration or commendation was worth that kind of death. Our officers couldn't even blame us. They feared these weapons as much as we did." The Hollywood portrayal of flame tanks typically shows them operating independently, dramatic centerpieces of battle scenes where they dominate the battlefield with streams of fire. The historical reality was far different. Flame tanks almost always operated as part of combined arms teams, with conventional tanks providing protection and suppressive fire, while infantry secured flanks and identified targets. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Drake, who commanded a composite tank battalion during the Huertgen Forest campaign, emphasized this integrated approach. A flame tank operating alone was simply a target. They required a protective screen of conventional armor, infantry with anti-tank weapons to secure the flanks, and often artillery support to suppress enemy anti-tank guns. The coordination demanded was immense. This reality created specialized tactical formations that evolved throughout the war. By late 1944, American forces typically deployed flame tanks in what became known as hunter-killer teams, groups of 3 to 5 vehicles with specific complementary roles. A typical team might include one M4A1 Sherman with a 76mm high-velocity gun to engage enemy armor, 2 standard Shermans with 75mm guns to provide suppressive fire, and 1 Satan flame tank to engage hardened targets. The British developed similar formations around their Churchill crocodiles, though the crocodile's towed trailer created additional vulnerability that required even more careful tactical employment. The trailer, containing 400 gallons of flame fuel, was connected to the tank by armored piping. While this design allowed greater flame capacity than internally carried systems, it also created a critical weakness. The connecting pipes could be damaged by artillery fragments or small arms fire. The trailer was both our greatest strength and our most dangerous vulnerability, wrote Captain Geoffrey Atkinson of the 141st Regiment Royal Armoured Corps. It gave us unmatched flame duration but created a 6-metre-long target behind us that, if penetrated, would engulf both the tank and trailer in a catastrophic fireball. This vulnerability led to specialised employment tactics. Churchill crocodiles typically approached objectives in reverse, with the tank between the enemy and the vulnerable trailer. This unusual movement pattern made them instantly recognisable to defenders and negated any element of surprise. Hollywood never portrays this awkward tactical reality, instead showing flame tanks charging boldly toward their targets. The German approach to flame tanks followed a different philosophy altogether. Rather than creating obviously distinctive vehicles like the Churchill crocodile, German engineers designed their Flammpanzers to appear identical to standard tanks from the outside. The Flammpanzer III, for example, maintained the silhouette of a regular Panzer III, with the flamethrower disguised to resemble the standard 50mm main gun. Hauptmann, Captain Werner Liebmann, who commanded a mixed company of conventional and flame Panzer IIIs on the Eastern Front, explained the rationale. The psychological impact comes not just from the flame itself, but from the uncertainty. Soviet tank crews could not identify which tanks carried flamethrowers until they opened fire. This created hesitation and caution across the entire front. This deception strategy proved effective but created its own complications. Captured Flammpanzer crews were often treated with particular brutality by Soviet forces who viewed the disguised nature of the weapons as a form of treachery. The Geneva Convention's protections for prisoners of war were frequently ignored for flame tank operators on all sides, another grim reality that Hollywood depictions routinely overlook. The medical consequences of flame attacks created another dimension absent from most cinematic portrayals. Dr. Harold Jenkins, Chief Medical Officer for the 3rd Armoured Division, documented the challenges of treating flame injuries during the Ardennes campaign in December 1944. Burns from military flame weapons differ significantly from civilian fire injuries, he wrote in a medical report. The thickened fuel adheres to tissue, continuing to burn even when conventional firefighting methods are applied. The resulting injuries combine thermal burns with chemical exposure, creating uniquely difficult treatment challenges. Field hospitals developed specialized protocols for flame casualties, but survival rates remained dismally low for those directly exposed to tank-delivered fire. The typical casualty suffered third-degree burns over 60–80% of their body, well beyond what 1,940 seconds medical science could effectively treat. This grim reality further amplified the psychological impact of the weapons. The maintenance challenges of flame tanks created another burden rarely depicted in films. Technical Sergeant Walter Martinez, chief mechanic for a Sherman flame tank platoon, described the constant battle to keep the specialized equipment operational. These weren't just tanks, they were tanks with an entire additional weapons system grafted onto them, he noted. The flame equipment required specialized maintenance skills beyond standard tank mechanics, pressure systems leaked, fuel lines clogged, ignition systems failed in damp conditions. We spent 3 hours of maintenance for every hour of operation. This maintenance burden limited operational availability significantly. During the Battle of the Bulge, American flame tank units typically maintained only 50–60% of their vehicles in operational condition at any given time, far below the 75–80% availability rate of conventional Sherman tanks. This reality meant flame tanks were precious assets that commanders reserved for specific, high-value targets rather than routine operations. The tactical employment of flame tanks evolved significantly between 1944 and 1945, as both crews and commanders gained experience with their unique capabilities and limitations. Early deployments often wasted their potential through misunderstanding of their optimal roles. Major General Maurice Rose, commanding the 3rd Armoured Division during the Normandy breakout, initially viewed flame tanks as breakthrough weapons for offensive operations. After several costly failures, he reassessed their role. These are not spearhead weapons, they are specialized tools for specific obstacles. Using them in the leading elements of an attack squanders their potential and exposes their vulnerabilities. This realization led to more sophisticated employment doctrines across all Allied forces. By early 1945, flame tanks were typically held in reserve until reconnaissance identified suitable targets, bunkers, fortified buildings, trench systems, and other hardened positions that conventional weapons struggled to neutralize. They would then be brought forward with proper support for specific, limited operations. The Pacific Theater presented entirely different challenges for flame tank operations. The island-hopping campaign against Japanese forces featured terrain, tactical situations, and enemy defenses that differed dramatically from the European experience. Marine Corps flame tank units faced unique challenges in this environment. Major Robert Wellington, commanding the 1st Tank Battalion's flame section during the Battle of Okinawa, described these differences. In Europe, flame tanks engaged discrete targets, bunkers, buildings, identified strongpoints. In the Pacific, particularly against cave complexes, the target was often invisible until you were practically on top of it. This required different tactics and created greater risks. Japanese defensive positions on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa featured extensive tunnel and cave networks, impervious to conventional artillery and aerial bombardment. These positions could only be neutralized through direct assault, making flame tanks particularly valuable despite their vulnerabilities. Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Harkins, who served as a flame tank commander on Iwo Jima, described their effectiveness. We would approach a suspected cave entrance with infantry spotters, identifying firing ports and ventilation holes. A 3-second burst of flame into the main opening would follow the cave's internal contours, reaching areas no other weapon could touch. The effects were immediate and final. This effectiveness came at tremendous psychological cost to the operators. Pacific Theater flame tank crews reported significantly higher rates of combat fatigue than their European counterparts, with many requiring rotation after relatively few combat operations. The close-range nature of engagements, the visibility of the effects, and the knowledge that the cave systems contained not just combatants but sometimes civilians created profound moral injuries. Navy Chaplain Michael Sullivan, who counseled Marine tank crews during the Okinawa campaign, documented these psychological impacts. These men carry a unique burden. They witness the direct results of their actions in ways most combatants don't. The sounds, the smells, the aftermath. It stays with them. Many question whether what they're doing, however necessary for victory, crosses a moral line they never thought they'd approach. Hollywood's portrayal of flame tanks in Pacific combat typically emphasizes their physical effectiveness, while entirely omitting this psychological dimension. The operators are shown as stoic heroes, unfazed by the nature of their weapon, rather than complex human beings grappling with the moral weight of their actions. The technical evolution of flame tanks accelerated throughout the war, as combat experience revealed limitations and possibilities. Engineers from all major combatants continuously modified designs based on battlefield feedback. The American E4-5 system that equipped Sherman Satans in 1944 was a fifth-generation design, incorporating lessons from earlier versions that had proven inadequate in combat conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Patterson, who headed the U. Army's flamethrower development program at Aberdeen Proving Ground, described this evolution. The early models proved disappointing in real-world conditions. Range was insufficient. Reliability was poor. Fuel capacity limited operational duration. Each iteration addressed these shortcomings, but we were always conscious that these improvements came at the cost of lives lost using inferior equipment. By late 1944, flame tanks had evolved into weapons of remarkable technical sophistication. The Churchill Crocodile could project flame over 120 yards, nearly the length of a football field. The improved Sherman Satan could deliver a focused flame stream capable of penetrating apertures as small as 8 inches wide. The Soviet OT-34, while simpler, could operate in temperature extremes from -40 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. These technical achievements represented the culmination of wartime engineering efforts involving thousands of scientists, engineers, and technicians whose contributions remain largely uncredited in historical accounts and entirely absent from dramatic portrayals. The weapons that appeared on screen in post-war films were simplified caricatures of these sophisticated systems. The flame tank's legacy extended far beyond World War II. Their psychological impact proved so significant that the mere threat of their deployment affected tactical decisions in subsequent conflicts. During the Korean War, Chinese and North Korean forces developed specific counter-tactics against American flame tanks based on World War II experience. Major General William Dean, commander of the 24th Infantry Division during the early stages of the Korean conflict, noted this impact. Enemy forces would abandon otherwise defensible positions when our flame tanks approached. They had institutional memory of these weapons from the previous war and considered them a threat beyond their physical capabilities. This psychological shadow extended even to training and doctrine. Soviet tactical manuals from the 1952nd devoted entire sections to countering Western flame tanks, despite their increasingly limited deployment. The weapons had created an impression in military consciousness that outlived their practical battlefield relevance. The moral questions surrounding flame weapons grew more pronounced in the post-war period. The 1949 Geneva Convention addressed incendiary weapons, though not prohibiting them outright. International humanitarian law evolved to place increasing restrictions on their use, particularly against civilian populations or in civilian-occupied areas. Brigadier General Lawrence Williams, who had commanded conventional armor units alongside flame tanks during the European campaign, later became an advocate for restriction of these weapons. In testimony before a congressional committee in 1952, he stated, "Having witnessed their effects firsthand, I believe these weapons occupy a unique category of destructiveness. Their legitimate military utility cannot be denied, but neither can their profound humanitarian implications be ignored." The Vietnam War saw the final major deployment of tank-mounted flame weapons by American forces. The M67A2 Zippo flame tank, a modified M48 pattern, saw service between 1963 and 1974. Its operations were increasingly controversial, reflecting evolving public and military attitudes toward weapons perceived as particularly inhumane. Colonel Richard Matthews, who commanded an armored cavalry regiment in Vietnam, reflected on this changing perception. In World War II, flame tanks were seen as necessary tools against a fanatical enemy in prepared positions. In Vietnam, their use became increasingly difficult to justify as public opinion turned against the war. The weapon hadn't changed, but our collective moral calculation had. By the 1982nd, most Western nations had removed flame tanks from their arsenals, though flame weapons in portable form continued to see limited use in specialized operations. The 1980 Protocol 3 to the Geneva Convention placed significant restrictions on incendiary weapons, reflecting an international consensus that had been building since the end of World War II. This evolution, from tactical innovation to moral questioning to eventual restriction, represents the true legacy of the flame tank, a complexity entirely absent from Hollywood's simplistic portrayals. The real story wasn't just about a weapon's battlefield effectiveness, but about humanity's ongoing struggle to define the boundaries of acceptable warfare. The technical archives of flame tank development remained classified for decades after the war, limiting scholarly assessment of their true impact. When these documents began to be declassified in the 1970 seconds and 1980 seconds, they revealed a narrative far more nuanced than either wartime propaganda or post-war films had suggested. Dr. Jonathan Caldwell, a military historian who conducted the first comprehensive academic study of flame tanks using these newly available sources, concluded, "The gap between the historical reality and the popular understanding of these weapons is perhaps wider than for any other major World War II technology. They were simultaneously more technically sophisticated, tactically limited, and morally complex than any film has managed to portray. This gap between reality and portrayal raises important questions about how we collectively remember and understand the technological aspects of warfare." Hollywood's simplification, presenting flame tanks as either unstoppable superweapons or simplistic terror devices, obscures the complex interplay of technology, tactics, psychology, and ethics that defined their actual employment. The true story of World War II flame tanks encompasses not just the machines themselves, but the people who designed, maintained, operated, and faced them. It includes figures like Dr. Eleanor Chambers, whose pioneering work on fuel mixtures saved countless Allied lives by creating more reliable systems. It includes mechanics like Technical Sergeant Walter Martinez, who developed field modifications that made theoretical capabilities into practical realities. It includes commanders like Captain Michael Cavanaugh, who grappled daily with the moral implications of directing these weapons against fellow human beings. It includes the unnamed Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima caves, who faced weapons that left no possibility of surrender once employed. It includes the German infantry in the Huertgen forest, who laid down arms rather than face what they considered a fate worse than death. None of these perspectives, the designer, the maintainer, the operator, the target, has been fully captured in any cinematic portrayal. Each represents an essential part of understanding not just the weapon itself, but what it revealed about the nature of industrial warfare and its psychological dimensions. The story of flame tanks is ultimately a story about the human dimension of technology in combat, how mechanical innovations shape psychological realities, how tactical employment reflects cultural values, how individual operators carry the moral weight of collective military decisions. These complexities don't translate easily to screen, where the visual spectacle of the flame itself overwhelms the subtler human elements. As Sergeant Michael Cavanaugh wrote in his final diary entry before returning home in September 1945, "What I commanded wasn't just a tank with a specialized weapon, it was the physical embodiment of a moral calculus, the decision that certain means were justified by the end of victory." Hollywood will never show that part. They'll show the flame, but not the hand that directed it, or the mind that questioned it even while completing the mission. This observation, that the most important aspects of flame tank operations were precisely those least suited to visual media, helps explain why their cinematic portrayal has remained so consistently divorced from their historical reality. The gap isn't simply a matter of dramatic license or technical inaccuracy. It reflects the fundamental limitations of trying to represent the psychological and moral dimensions of warfare through visual spectacle alone. The legacy of World War II flame tanks lives on not just in military history, but in how we think about the relationship between technology and ethics in warfare. Their development, deployment, and eventual restriction represent a case study in how societies navigate the tension between military necessity and humanitarian principles. A negotiation that continues with each new weapons technology, from cluster munitions to autonomous systems. Understanding the reality behind Hollywood's portrayal matters not just for historical accuracy, but for how we collectively process the ethical questions surrounding modern warfare. When we reduce complex weapons systems and their human operators to simplified cinematic tropes, we lose the opportunity to engage with the profound questions they raise about the limits of acceptable violence, even in necessary conflicts. The flame tanks of World War II, stripped of Hollywood glamorization and properly situated in their technical, tactical, and ethical context, offer important lessons for contemporary discussions about emerging military technologies. Their story reminds us that no weapon exists independent of the human systems that create, deploy, and target it, and that these human dimensions often matter more than the technical specifications that receive primary attention. For veterans like Michael Cavanaugh, who returned to his Boston firefighter father's home with a perspective on fire's destructive potential that films could never capture, the gap between Hollywood portrayal and lived experience remained unbridgeable. "Those who know don't need to be shown," he wrote years later, "and those who don't know can't really be shown, not in ways that matter." This sentiment, that some aspects of warfare resist authentic portrayal, speaks to the limitations of even the most technically accurate film depictions. What's lost isn't just technical detail, but the human complexity that gives meaning to those details. The true story of World War II flame tanks isn't fundamentally about fire and steel, but about the people who wielded those elements and those who faced them. A human story beneath the spectacle that Hollywood has yet to fully tell. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.